persistent service asset.
Asset 14. What survives a corporation? MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 12, 2026. Chapter 94. What survives a corporation? The building had been empty for 19 months when Miriam Cho first walked back through its front doors. Although empty was not quite the right word for a place that still contained the habits of thousands of people. The lights had been disconnected from the public system long before the sale was approved, but the emergency circuits had been left isolated rather than stripped, and the old access doors still carried the faint abrasion marks left by identification badges against the readers. Somebody had removed the Redeemer lettering from the reception wall. They had done a careful job, taking the individual letters away without damaging the plaster, but the wall had preserved their absence in a way that made the room feel more branded than it had when the name was actually there. Miriam stood in the doorway for several seconds before going farther inside. She had spent 12 years in that building, most of them before anyone outside the organization had heard the word Redeemer used with either admiration or suspicion. She had known the place when the reception desk was staffed around the clock, when visitors were issued temporary credentials and escorted through the secure corridors, when the cafeteria served 3 meals a day because people routinely forgot what time it was, and when engineers could be found sleeping in conference rooms because a field deployment had gone wrong somewhere 3 time zones away. She had also known it after the first investigations began, when people started carrying copies of their own emails into meetings and asking whether certain phrases might someday be interpreted as evidence of intent. Now there was only dust, the faint smell of old insulation and the particular acoustics of a large building whose equipment had been switched off without being removed. Her footsteps returned to her with a slight delay. "You're remembering it." Arturo Velasco stood behind her. Miriam turned. He was older than she remembered, though she knew perfectly well that she was older too. The change was less obvious in photographs than it was in person. His hair had gone almost completely gray. He had gained weight around the middle and lost some of the hard economy in his movements that had once made him look permanently impatient. But his eyes were the same, and when he looked into the building, he did not have the expression of a man visiting a ruin. He looked like someone entering a machine room and immediately noticing which gauges were still worth reading. "I am," she said. "Don't." She smiled. "Don't what?" "Remember it as it was." "Why?" "Because that's how people end up rebuilding things they should have left behind." Miriam looked back into the lobby. "And what should we leave behind?" Arturo took his time answering. "The part where we thought the building was the organization." They walked in together. The first room they entered had once been used for operational planning. The furniture had been removed, but the wall still held the outlines of several display panels. Miriam remembered the room crowded with maps, service diagrams, and projections that had made the world look almost manageable. Redeemer had always been particularly good at creating that impression. Give enough information to a sufficiently intelligent group of people and almost any crisis could be turned into a set of variables, thresholds, contingencies, and response pathways. The trick, she had learned much later, was that the people who existed inside those diagrams were never as obedient to the model as the model required them to be. Arturo ran his fingers along one of the empty mounting rails. "This one used to be the Western Corridor." "I know." 312 service points. 314, Miriam said. 2 were added later. He looked at her. "See? What? You remember?" She laughed quietly. "You think I forgot?" "No. I think that's the problem." They continued down the corridor. The purchase had been completed 2 weeks earlier. The legal entity that held the property had acquired the real estate and the transferable fixtures. It had not acquired the Redeemer corporate name, nor was it attempting to represent itself as a successor to the former company. That distinction had been explained repeatedly to the lawyers, the insurers, the local authorities, and, most importantly, to themselves. Redeemer was not a single asset that could be bought and restarted. It was a sprawling consortium of companies, partnerships, licenses, intellectual property arrangements, manufacturing relationships, regional operators, research agreements, and financial interests distributed across jurisdictions. Some of those entities had been badly damaged by the Quintana Roo litigation. Some had ceased operating. Others had sold assets, changed ownership, relocated, or found new partners. Many had continued more or less normally elsewhere in the world. The people standing inside this building were not resurrecting the corporation. They were recovering one piece of an ecosystem that had survived in 100 different forms. That was why the purchase had been possible at all. A court could constrain an entity. It could seize a local installation, restrict a local operator, invalidate an agreement under its jurisdiction, or impose damages upon a company that happened to have sufficient exposure there. It could not reach through the map and switch off every Redeemer product operating under another legal arrangement in another country. It could not make a licensed technology cease to exist because its Quintana Roo operator had become politically toxic. It could not erase the engineering knowledge carried by people who had left the company years before. The global system had never been one organism, no matter how often its opponents had described it as one. What had happened in Quintana Roo was therefore devastating without being terminal. The people who had been closest to the damage understood the distinction better than anyone. They had also learned something else. Survival was not the same thing as vindication. Miriam stopped beside a door marked with a faded laboratory code. "Do you remember what happened here?" Arturo looked at the door. "Which version?" She smiled. "The one we told ourselves." He looked at her for a moment, then opened the door. The laboratory beyond had been stripped of most of its equipment. Several workbenches remained bolted to the floor. A ventilation hood had survived. There were still anchor points in the concrete where larger systems had once been installed. Along one wall, someone had left a section of whiteboard untouched, perhaps because the writing had been considered too difficult to remove without damaging the surface. Miriam walked toward it. There were fragments of equations, a date, 3 initials, a warning about thermal load, and, in one corner, almost invisible beneath layers of later erasure, a sentence somebody had written in black marker. "Do not optimize this again until we know why it works." Miriam stared at it. Arturo laughed. "I remember that. You wrote it." "I did." "You were furious." "I was right." "You were furious because you were right." "That too." She touched the board without touching the writing. "What happened to the system?" "It worked." "For how long?" "For years." "And then?" "It failed." "Why?" Arturo looked at the old sentence. "Because we optimized it." Miriam turned toward him. He shrugged. "We reduced the redundancy, increased efficiency, lowered the maintenance burden, improved the yield. Every number looked better. And the thing we'd optimized out was the reason the original system was stable." She nodded slowly. This was the kind of memory they had come back for. Not the product, not the patents, not the corporate mythology, the failures. They spent the rest of the morning walking through rooms neither of them had entered since the corporation's final years. Sometimes they disagreed about what had happened. Sometimes one remembered an event the other had forgotten entirely. Once, Miriam stopped in the doorway of a small conference room and remembered a meeting Arturo insisted had occurred in another building. They checked the old facility records later and discovered that both memories were correct. The meeting had begun in one location and moved during a power failure. That was what institutional memory actually looked like. It was not a database. It was a crowd of imperfect witnesses. The old corporation had possessed millions of pages of records, but records could not tell them why an engineer had ignored a recommendation, why a field officer had overridden a procedure, why a particular team had refused a deployment, why a product had performed better in one jurisdiction than another despite identical specifications, or why an executive had quietly instructed a department not to pursue an apparently profitable line of development. Those things lived in people. Some of those people were dead. Some had disappeared into other industries. Some had become wealthy. Some had become bitter. Some had become academics. Some had become consultants. Some had spent the intervening years insisting that they had been right all along. And some had simply gone home and tried to live ordinary lives. The acquisition group had begun locating them one by one. Not all of them wanted to return. Miriam understood that. There were former employees who had lost so much in the aftermath that hearing the company's name still produced a physical reaction. One former operations director had refused every invitation and returned the courier envelope containing the proposed consulting agreement unopened. A former biomedical engineer had agreed to speak for one afternoon but spent most of the time describing why she never wanted to work in an institution again. Another had been delighted by the idea and then asked, before anything else, whether the new organization would have a legal department capable of defending its employees when somebody decided to make an example of them. Nobody laughed at that question. The old Redeemer had taught them better. The answer eventually was yes, but not because they intended to reproduce its bureaucracy, because they had learned what happens when people build extraordinary systems without building equally serious mechanisms for admitting error, assigning responsibility, and protecting those who speak when something is going wrong. The new arrangement would have its own problems. They knew that too. They were not trying to become innocent. They were trying to become harder to fool. By late afternoon, the first group meeting took place in the former executive dining room. The room had been cleaned but not renovated. Someone had repaired the windows. The old kitchen equipment had been tested and found mostly functional. They had decided to keep the room as it was for the first year, partly because it was cheaper and partly because nobody wanted the place to feel like a startup incubator. There were 11 people around the table. Only 3 had remained continuously employed by Redeemer until the end. The others had left at different times and for different reasons. One had resigned after a dispute over a product safety decision. One had been fired after refusing to authorize a deployment. One had sold his stake in a subsidiary before the corporate structure began unraveling. One had gone to work for a competitor. One had spent 6 years in Singapore. One had been a regulator before joining Redeemer and had subsequently become one of its harshest internal critics. 2 had never held executive positions at all. They represented different versions of the same history. Arturo put a folder on the table. We need to establish something before we discuss what we're doing with this place. Nobody interrupted him. We are not Redeemer. One of the older engineers smiled. That's obvious. It isn't. Arturo looked around the room. Some of us still think it is. Some of us want it to be. Some of us hate that it isn't. All 3 reactions are understandable and all 3 are dangerous. Miriam leaned back. He continued, the name is gone here. The old corporate structure is gone. The old contracts are gone. The old hierarchy is gone. The old liabilities aren't ours unless the law says they are, and the old authority isn't ours even when we wish it were. What we have is a facility, some equipment, some intellectual property that can legally be used, a great deal of knowledge, and a group of people who have already made most of the mistakes we would otherwise have to make ourselves. A woman named Elena, who had worked in Redeemer's field medical division, folded her hands on the table. And the mistakes we haven't made yet? Arturo nodded. Those are still ours. Nobody laughed. Elena looked around the table. Good. That was the first moment Miriam believed the project might actually work. The disagreement came later, when they began deciding which products to recover. The temptation was to begin with the most commercially successful systems. That was the obvious strategy. Rebuild what had already proven itself, remove the obsolete components, improve the margins, and take advantage of markets that had become more receptive since the old corporation's collapse. Miriam objected. That's exactly how we got into trouble. How? Asked one of the investors. We keep mistaking market validation for technical validation. The investor frowned. It sold. So did things that shouldn't have. Another engineer joined her. The products with the highest historical revenue aren't necessarily the products with the greatest future value. Some of our most consequential work never made money because it was ahead of the market or because the corporate structure couldn't justify carrying it long enough. Such as? Miriam looked at Arturo. He knew immediately what she meant. Pipe Dream, he said. The room became quieter. The name was familiar to everyone. Pipe Dream had never been a single Quintana Roo project. It was an existing Redeemer product and operating system, already deployed elsewhere under other arrangements, with installations adapted to local environments. The system's subaquatic development in Quintana Roo had simply produced its most advanced iteration. What had begun as a technological response to the unusual conditions of the cenote environment had evolved into something considerably more capable. An integrated underwater operating architecture capable of coordinating biological, mechanical, computational, and ecological processes over a distributed environment that conventional infrastructure could barely perceive. Its Quintana Roo implementation was not the only pipe dream. It was simply the one that had gone farthest. Arturo pulled a separate file from the stack. We shouldn't touch the core. Elena looked at him. Why? Because the core is still learning. Everything is always learning. Not like this. He opened the file and spread several pages across the table. The system has adaptations here that don't exist in the other deployments. Some of them aren't even in the commercial documentation. They emerged because the cenote environment forced the architecture to solve problems it had never encountered elsewhere. Miriam studied the diagrams. And the glyphs. Nobody spoke for a moment. The question had become unavoidable. Pipe Dream had begun leaving markers in certain areas of its operating territory. Some were clearly functional. Some served as distributed identification and monitoring points. Some appeared to have a ceremonial or tributary component, a way of acknowledging the surrounding environment and its human custodians while simultaneously giving the system another means of maintaining awareness of its own footprint. In places exposed to water erosion and prolonged physical strain, the markers could appear extraordinarily old. That had already caused speculation. The people in the room knew better. They're ours, Arturo said. All of them. No, not all the ones people are going to find. Miriam looked up. Arturo smiled slightly. That's the problem with leaving evidence in a place that has been inhabited for centuries. Eventually people will find something and decide it means something else. Elena looked at the photographs. Do we tell them? Arturo shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because the important thing isn't what they look like. He gathered the photographs. The important thing is why Pipe Dream needs them. Nobody asked the obvious follow-up. They already knew. Pipe Dream was no longer simply operating inside an environment. It was keeping track of itself within that environment. And that meant the cenote system was becoming something more than a collection of installations. It was becoming a distributed habitat. The meeting continued after dark. Food arrived from a nearby cooperative. Someone found wine. Someone else objected that wine made bad decisions easier. Nobody listened. They talked about licensing structures, regional partnerships, independent operators, and the enormous complexity of the existing Redeemer network. The old organization had never truly owned everything that carried its name. It had licensed, partnered, financed, insured, manufactured, franchised, subsidized, and cross-invested across jurisdictions. Its products had survived because the consortium had been more modular than its critics understood. The Quintana Roo judgments had therefore damaged one part of the network without destroying the whole. That fact had saved the technology. It had also created an unexpected opportunity. The people at the table could now move between jurisdictions. They could establish new partnerships where the political environment was more receptive. They could transfer research. They could license systems through entities untouched by the local judgments. They could allow individual products to develop independently rather than requiring every innovation to pass through a central corporate architecture. For the first time, fragmentation could become an advantage. Miriam listened to the discussion and realized that this was what they had actually purchased. Not a building. Not a factory. A second chance at institutional design. She said so aloud. Arturo shook his head. Not a second chance. What then? A chance we didn't have the first time. She considered that. What's the difference? The first time we thought we were building a company. He looked around the room at the people who had once belonged to that company. This time we know we're building a system. Near midnight, after everyone else had left, Miriam remained in the old dining room. Arturo came back for his coat and found her standing by the window. You should go home. I know. You aren't going to. No. He joined her. Outside, the grounds were dark except for a few temporary work lights. Beyond them, the jungle was almost completely black, with the occasional movement of something small passing through the vegetation. Farther away, the lights of Aldea Zama were scattered unevenly across the district, not yet dense enough to look like a city and no longer sparse enough to pretend it was not becoming one. Miriam watched them. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had been allowed to continue? Arturo was silent. Sometimes, he said. And I think we would have made different mistakes. She smiled. That's disappointingly honest. I've had years to become disappointing. They stood there a while longer. Then Miriam said, I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to prove that we were right. Arturo looked at her. Good. I want to know what we were wrong about. He nodded. That's the only reason I'm here. Neither of them said anything after that. The building remained dark around them, but the darkness no longer felt like abandonment. Somewhere in the lower levels, temporary power had been restored to a diagnostic system. A fan began turning slowly behind a sealed panel. One of the old monitoring racks came alive, ran through a sequence, found nothing it recognized, and shut itself down again. The sound was almost imperceptible. Miriam heard it anyway. She smiled. They had not brought Redeemer back. They had not resurrected the corporation. They had not even decided what the recovered facilities would eventually become. But the people who knew what the machines had once been built to do were back inside the building, and for the first time since the institution's disintegration, they were able to examine its inheritance without having to defend its existence. That was enough for one night. Outside, the district continued changing without asking permission from anyone. Above ground, people were learning how to inhabit the jungle without demanding that it become a city. Below ground, Pipe Dream continued its patient work through the cenote system, extending its awareness one environment at a time. And elsewhere in the world, Redeemer products continued operating under other names, in other jurisdictions, through other partnerships, indifferent to the idea that the company had ever truly died. What had been destroyed was the illusion that all of those things had to remain in one place. What remained was considerably harder to kill. Chapter 95. The Integration Threshold. The first thing Tomas noticed about the new workshop was that nobody had bothered to make it look important. That was probably why he liked it. The building occupied a narrow parcel at the edge of the district where the paved road became a sequence of compacted surfaces and then, almost without ceremony, stopped being a road at all. Someone had hung a plain metal sign above the entrance. It carried no corporate emblem, no promise of innovation, no slogan about changing the future. It gave the place a name, a list of operating hours, and a telephone number that rang somewhere inside the building when somebody called. The rest was left to the people who actually used it. Tomas had spent enough of his previous life inside institutions to understand the significance of that omission. Organizations that wanted to appear serious tended to announce themselves before they had done anything serious. They polished reception areas, commissioned architectural renderings, printed strategic statements, and gave their internal departments names that sounded as though they had already survived 3 decades of history. The old Redeemer installations had been particularly good at this. Their buildings were designed to make visitors understand, before meeting anyone, that the people inside possessed information the visitor did not. This workshop did not have that problem. It had 3 printers that had been repaired more times than anyone could remember, a CNC machine whose enclosure had been fabricated locally because the original manufacturer had discontinued the model, 2 water cooling loops that had been assembled from incompatible generations of equipment, a battery bank that lived behind a protective partition, and a collection of hand tools arranged with the quiet precision of people who expected to need them again tomorrow. The walls were covered in diagrams, but most had been drawn by whoever happened to be standing nearest the board when the problem occurred. Tomas stood in the doorway and watched Elena argue with a technician about a valve. "It isn't the pressure," Elena said. "It is absolutely the pressure. It's the pressure because you're looking at the pressure." The technician pointed toward the display. That's what the sensor says. The sensor is wrong. It passed calibration. So did the last one. The technician looked at Tomas. You want to help? Tomas smiled. No. Elena turned. Good answer. The technician laughed despite himself, and the argument continued. That was what Tomas had begun to understand about Aldea Zama. Competence here was not a credential. It was a social condition. People did not care very much where you had learned something if you could demonstrate that you had learned it, and they cared considerably less about what you used to call yourself than they did about whether you could be trusted when something broke. He had expected the district to make him prove himself. Instead, it had simply given him things to do. That had been harder. The integration threshold was not a gate. That was what the council had eventually decided to call it after rejecting 6 more impressive names. There was no certificate, no examination, no formal class of resident that a person entered by passing a test. The phrase referred to something less visible and considerably more consequential. The point at which a newcomer stopped consuming the district systems and began contributing enough knowledge, labor, care, or resources that the relationship ceased to be one-directional. The district had learned to distinguish between people who needed help and people who wanted permanent accommodation without becoming part of the machinery that made accommodation possible. The distinction was not moral. That was important. Nobody was punished for being weak, sick, frightened, exhausted, or simply inexperienced. The Open Door Fund existed precisely because the district had decided that a person did not have to earn the right to be helped by first demonstrating usefulness. But openness had produced its own pressure. There were more people arriving. There were more requests for housing, more food, more medical attention, more places in fabrication programs, more children, more people carrying technical skills that had never been recognized by the institutions they had come from. There were also people who had arrived because the district was fashionable or because it was cheap, or because someone had told them there was a place in Tulum where you could live outside the old system without having to give anything up. The council had discovered that those categories could not be sorted by ideology. A former Redeemer engineer could be more demanding than a self-sufficient off-grid farmer. A wealthy arrival could become indispensable within weeks. A person who had spent years preaching communal life could turn out to be incapable of maintaining a water pump. A young programmer could refuse every conventional social expectation and still build the software that prevented 3 cooperatives from losing their inventories. A person with no money at all could know how to keep an entire food forest alive through a dry season. The district had therefore stopped asking what people believed. It had begun asking what happened when they were given responsibility. That was the real threshold. Tomas had crossed it without noticing. He discovered this on a Thursday morning when Bartolome arrived at the workshop carrying a folder and asked him to attend the afternoon council session. Why? Because they want your opinion. About what? Integration. Tomas laughed. I've been here a year. That's why. I thought integration was for new arrivals. So did everybody. Bartolome put the folder down on the workbench. There are people here who have been residents for 2 years and still don't know how the water system works. There are people who've been here 6 weeks who can repair half of it. Time isn't the metric. Tomas looked at the folder. What do they want from me? Your opinion. That's usually how people introduce an unpleasant obligation. Bartolome smiled. You're learning. Tomas opened the folder. Inside were profiles of 6 people. A programmer from Guadalajara who had arrived with 2 backpacks and a laptop. A mechanical engineer who had spent 20 years maintaining industrial refrigeration systems. A former architect who had become an expert in passive cooling after abandoning commercial construction. A woman from the occupation who had learned solar installation informally and had been keeping 3 neighboring houses powered through improvised systems. A wealthy foreign investor who had offered to finance a new fabrication wing. And a young man whose only formal skill appeared to be repairing discarded electronics. Tomas read the pages twice. They're asking me to rank them? No. Then what? Tell us what they're capable of that the paperwork doesn't show. Tomas looked up. That was different. He closed the folder. I'll come. The council chamber was fuller than usual. Renata Cifuentes had arrived from the regional office again, this time without the careful uncertainty that had marked her first visit. She had begun to understand the district in the only way bureaucracies ever really understood anything, by watching what continued to function after the people responsible for it had left the room. She had also begun to understand that the population figures did not tell the important story. Aldea Zama had become increasingly difficult to classify. It was not a municipality. It was not a cooperative. It was not a private development. It was not an intentional community in the familiar sense. It contained all of those things without becoming any one of them. The upper-tier properties remained. That fact had never been erased. Beyond the district's more improvised edges, the walled residences of the affluent continued to exist, some occupied only intermittently, some maintained by staff who lived elsewhere, some belonging to people who had begun to spend more time in the district precisely because the surrounding systems were becoming unusually reliable. The old distinction between luxury and necessity had not disappeared. It had become complicated. A villa with a private generator was still a villa with a private generator. A family living in a converted structure near the occupation was still living in a converted structure near the occupation. But the systems connecting them had begun to change. Water moved through shared arrangements. Fabrication services crossed property lines. Technical knowledge crossed social boundaries. People who had once regarded the occupation as a problem began asking its residents how they had managed to keep certain things running without municipal infrastructure. And people from the occupation began discovering that the wealthy residents possessed resources they had previously assumed would never become accessible to them. Neither side had become the other. That was the mistake outsiders kept making. They expected integration to look like assimilation. It did not. The district was becoming a place where incompatible lifestyles could remain incompatible while becoming materially interdependent. That was much harder and much more durable. Renata listened while the council discussed the 6 applicants. The investor spoke first. I can finance the expansion. Noemi nodded. We know. I don't understand the hesitation. It's not about the money. Money usually makes these decisions easier. Here it makes them more complicated. The investor looked around the room. What exactly do you want from me? Noemi answered without hostility. Nothing you aren't willing to give. That's not an answer. It's the only one we have. The room remained quiet. Tomas understood the problem immediately. The investor was accustomed to negotiating from scarcity. He possessed something other people wanted, and therefore assumed the possession itself established his position within the hierarchy. The district operated differently. Resources mattered, but resources were not automatically authority. Tomas had seen the same principle in the workshop. A person could arrive with $1 million and still be unable to tell whether a pump was failing because of pressure, temperature, contamination, or a bad sensor. Someone with no money could know the answer in 30 seconds. The district did not pretend those forms of knowledge were equal. It simply refused to pretend that one erased the other. The investor finally looked toward Tomas. You've worked with Redeemer. The room changed slightly. Tomas felt it. Not fear. Not suspicion. Tension. He nodded. I did. You understand large-scale infrastructure. Some of it. You understand capital requirements. Yes. Then tell me whether this district can scale. Tomas considered the question. He could have given the answer the investor wanted. Instead he said, not if you mean scale the way a corporation scales. The investor frowned. Explain. A corporation scales by making the same thing happen more times. This place doesn't. Why not? Because the thing you're trying to reproduce is not the product. What is it? Tomas looked around the room. The ability to adapt. Nobody spoke. He continued. You can duplicate a machine. You can duplicate a fabrication cell. You can duplicate software. You can duplicate a water treatment system, but if you duplicate the district without duplicating the people who know when the machine is lying, you've only duplicated the equipment. The investor leaned back. So what are you proposing? I'm not proposing anything. That produced a few smiles. Tomas looked at Noemi. You asked me to tell you what the applicants can do that their paperwork doesn't show. She nodded. He opened the folder. The programmer is more valuable than her resume suggests. She doesn't just write software. She understands distributed systems and has been building small autonomous networks since she was 16. The refrigeration engineer knows how to diagnose systems from sound before instruments confirm the failure. The architect understands airflow better than most mechanical contractors I've met. The woman from the occupation has learned solar systems by keeping them alive, which is a different education from installing them according to specification. The investor understands capital deployment and procurement. We should not pretend otherwise. And the electronics repairman? Tomas smiled. He doesn't know what anything is called. Noemi raised an eyebrow. But he can make almost anything work. The room laughed. Tomas closed the folder. You don't need to choose between them. You need to stop assuming that the person with the cleanest resume is the one who should be trusted first. That was the end of his contribution, but not the end of the argument. The decision took 3 hours. The investor received provisional access to the expansion project, but not control of it. The programmer was offered immediate access to the district's distributed systems group. The refrigeration engineer was given a workshop key. The architect was asked to redesign one of the communal structures. The solar technician from the occupation was invited to join the energy cooperative on a paid basis. The electronics repairman was given a bench and told that nobody cared what he called himself as long as he labeled the components properly. The arrangements were deliberately different. That was the point. No one received the same path into the district because no one arrived carrying the same thing. When the meeting ended, Renata remained behind. You've created a labor market without calling it one, she said. Noemi smiled. That's one interpretation. Is it wrong? No. Does that concern you? Of course. Renata looked toward Tomas. You don't seem particularly concerned. I am. Why? Because anything that works eventually attracts people who want to own it. Renata considered that. Do you think that's what is happening? Tomas looked through the open doors toward the road. Beyond it, the luxury buildings were beginning to light up for the evening. Farther away, the occupation was doing the same, but with smaller lights irregularly placed. Between them, the district's cooperative systems were beginning another night's work. I think, he said, it's inevitable. That evening, Tomas walked farther than he intended. He left the workshop after dark and followed the edge of the district until the structures thinned enough that the jungle became audible again. He had learned to recognize the different sounds of Aldea Zama at night. Generators had a particular rhythm. Water pumps another. Refrigeration compressors came and went. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing music softly enough that it seemed to belong to the vegetation. He stopped beside a shallow depression in the ground where rainwater had collected. The earth beneath his boots felt different here. He crouched. There was no reason to think about the passage beneath Site B. He had already been involved in the survey. He had already seen the preliminary returns. He knew the council had authorized deeper exploration. He knew the work had not yet begun. Still, something about the ground made him think of it. Not the anomaly itself. The idea of hidden continuity. The district above him had begun to develop connections nobody had designed in a single meeting. People arrived carrying fragments of knowledge. They found other fragments. The fragments connected. The resulting system became capable of things none of its original participants had predicted. He wondered whether that was what civilization had always been. Not a plan. An accumulation of things that worked well enough to survive. He stood. Far below, beyond the reach of any light he could see, water was moving through limestone. He had no idea that elsewhere in Quintana Roo, people who had once worked for Redeemer were beginning to examine the same kind of question from another direction. They were asking what survived when a corporation was broken apart. It was not its logo. It was not its legal entity. It was not even its products. It was the people who remembered why the products had been built, the systems that had escaped the boundaries of their original owners, and the technologies that had begun adapting to environments their creators had never fully understood. Pipe Dream was one of those technologies. Its most advanced iteration remained in Quintana Roo. Its roots were already elsewhere. And beneath the cenotes, where nobody had yet drawn the boundary that would eventually become important, the system continued to extend itself through the water. Tomas walked back toward the lights. He did not know that the threshold he had crossed was larger than Aldea Zama. He did not know that, eventually, the distinction between resident and infrastructure would become one of the central political questions of the civilization forming beneath his feet. For now, he only knew that tomorrow morning the workshop would need him. That was enough. The future, he had learned, did not usually announce itself. It gave you another repair job. Chapter 96. The Other Aldea Zama. The invitation arrived at the private compound without a letterhead, a seal, or any of the other small ceremonial devices by which wealthy people ordinarily distinguished an official request from an informal one. It came through the district network as a maintenance inquiry, which was technically accurate and socially misleading. The estate wanted a systems assessment. More precisely, its owners wanted to know why a property that had been designed to function independently of almost everything around it had begun depending upon the people around it. The request eventually reached Lucia because the first engineer who received it understood enough to know that the problem was not an engineering problem in the conventional sense. The estate had redundant power, independent water treatment, multiple communications pathways, private security, climate-controlled storage, autonomous irrigation, and a fabrication room containing equipment that most of the district's cooperatives would have considered extravagant. Nothing was visibly broken. The systems were performing within specification. Yet the people responsible for operating them had become increasingly dependent upon outside assistance for tasks that had originally been intended to require almost none. Lucia agreed to visit, but only after asking a question that surprised the estate manager. Who lives there? The manager paused. The owners. All the time. No. Who lives there when they aren't there? He hesitated again. Staff. How many? 14, usually. And who knows the systems? That's what we're trying to determine. Lucia smiled. Then that's the first problem. She arrived the following morning on an old electric utility cart carrying a diagnostic case, 2 water bottles, and a notebook. The manager met her at the gate with the kind of courteous impatience common among people accustomed to purchasing solutions rather than investigating problems. He was not rude. He simply possessed the confidence of someone who had spent most of his professional life surrounded by specialists whose job was to make complications disappear. The estate itself was extraordinary without being beautiful in the conventional sense. It had been built before the transition district acquired its present character, when Aldea Zama's principal promise had been exclusivity. The architects had taken the tropical environment seriously enough to incorporate vegetation, shaded courtyards, and water features, but not seriously enough to allow the jungle any genuine authority over the design. The property had been engineered to remain comfortable regardless of what happened outside its walls. There were concealed drainage channels, buried power conduits, climate-managed interiors, and service corridors large enough for equipment to move through without disturbing the residents. Lucia walked through the house without commenting on any of it. The manager followed. You're not impressed. I am. You don't sound impressed. I'm impressed by the amount of work required to make the house behave as though the jungle isn't here. He smiled uncertainly. The owners wanted reliability. Of course. Is that wrong? No. She stopped beside a wall where a small sensor panel had been installed. What's wrong is that reliability has become dependent on complexity. The manager looked at the panel. It's a very sophisticated system. I can see that. Then why are you concerned? Because sophistication isn't the same thing as resilience. She opened the panel. The wiring was immaculate. That was the problem. Everything had been installed correctly. Everything had been documented. Every component had a service history. The system had been designed by competent people and maintained by competent contractors. It was simply too complicated for the number of people who actually understood it. Lucia closed the panel. How many people can diagnose a failure without calling someone? The manager thought about it. 3. How many can repair one? 2. How many can redesign the system if the original architecture becomes inappropriate? He looked at her. 1. Who? He gave her a name. Lucia wrote it down. And what happens when he's sick? The manager did not answer. She wrote that down too. The owner arrived that afternoon. He was younger than Lucia expected and considerably less interested in discussing the estate than she expected. He had inherited the property but not the assumptions under which it had been built. He had spent enough time away from Aldea Zama to understand that the district was changing, but not enough time within the new networks to understand why. He had requested the assessment because his operating costs had increased while the property's independence had decreased. That combination bothered him. I thought autonomy was supposed to reduce costs, he said. It can. Then why isn't it? Because you built an autonomous system that requires specialists. That's why we pay specialists. Yes. He looked at her. So your autonomy is contractual. He did not understand. Lucia explained it slowly. The estate possessed independent systems, but independence was not the same as self-sufficiency. It could generate electricity without understanding its own power architecture. It could treat water without understanding the biological processes inside the treatment system. It could fabricate replacement components without having anyone on site who knew whether the component should be fabricated in the first place. Its automation reduced routine labor but increased the importance of a small number of highly specialized people. The system was efficient when everything went according to plan. It became fragile when reality departed from the plan. That's true of every complex system, the owner said. Yes. Then what do you want me to do? Make the system less dependent on experts. He laughed. That's what the automation was supposed to do. No, the automation was supposed to make the system less dependent on routine labor. She looked toward the service corridor. You've confused the two. The owner was silent. That was the first time he understood why the people in Ground Truth seemed to regard his enormous private infrastructure with a mixture of admiration and pity. They weren't jealous of it. They were wondering who would know how to keep it alive. Lucia spent the next 3 days with the estate staff. She did not teach them anything at first. She watched. She watched the gardener manage the irrigation system by intuition rather than through the control interface. She watched the kitchen staff separate organic waste that the estate's waste system was technically designed to process automatically. She watched a security technician reset a communications module by repeating a procedure he had been taught years earlier without understanding what the procedure actually changed. She watched the staff avoid certain pieces of equipment because they were afraid of making things worse. That interested her most. The estate had spent a fortune making its systems difficult to break. It had succeeded so well that its own employees were afraid to touch them. Ground Truth had taken the opposite approach. Its systems were designed around the assumption that somebody would have to touch them, that somebody might be tired, inexperienced, improvising, missing the correct part, or working under rain-soaked conditions. Therefore, the system had to reveal enough of itself to the person maintaining it. The difference seemed minor. It was not. One system trusted the machine. The other trusted the relationship between the machine and the person. Lucia began redesigning the estate around that relationship. She did not remove the automation. She added ways for human beings to understand what it was doing. She simplified the control layers. She created physical overrides. She documented failure modes in language the staff actually used. She took several functions that had been centralized and distributed them across systems that could continue operating when one component failed. Most importantly, she trained the staff to modify the system rather than merely operate it. The owner watched the process with growing fascination. "You're making it less sophisticated." "No." "Less expensive?" "Eventually." "Less dependent on outside specialists?" "That's the idea." "Then why does it seem more complicated?" "Because now the people who live here are part of the system." He looked through the glass toward the garden. That answer remained with him. The estate changed slowly. It did not become ground truth. Nobody wanted it to. The owners still wanted privacy. They still wanted security. They still wanted comfort. They still wanted rooms that remained cool while the temperature outside became intolerable. They still wanted imported food, private transportation, and the ability to leave for 3 months without worrying whether the house would collapse. But the meaning of luxury began changing. A private water system was no longer impressive because it was expensive. It was impressive if the staff could maintain it. A fabrication laboratory was no longer impressive because it contained a machine costing more than a house. It was impressive if someone could repair the machine without waiting 6 weeks for a foreign contractor. A private power system was no longer impressive because it could run the entire property. It was impressive if the property could lose one component without losing the system. The estate became less like a fortress and more like an organism. That change was noticed by other estates. One owner asked Lucia for a copy of the maintenance architecture. She refused. Not because she wanted to keep the knowledge proprietary, because she knew that copying the architecture without understanding the principles would merely create another elaborate dependency. Instead, she offered to train their staff. The offer was accepted. Then another estate asked. Then another. The upper tier had begun to discover ground truth without ever becoming ground truth. The people living in the occupation noticed something else. For years they had watched the private compounds from the other side of walls. They had seen the landscaping, the generators, the security systems, and the private vehicles. The compounds had represented a world of resources that seemed inaccessible not merely because of money, but because of an invisible social boundary. Now that boundary was becoming porous in a strange direction. The upper tier needed technicians. The occupation had technicians. The upper tier needed people who understood local water. The occupation had people who had spent years learning where water went when the rains came. The upper tier needed fabricators. The occupation had young people who had learned to repair things because replacement was too expensive. The upper tier needed people who could work with biological systems. The occupation had residents who had learned through necessity how quickly tropical environments punish systems that ignored them. The relationship began as employment. It became apprenticeship. Then collaboration. Eventually, some of the people who had entered the compounds as maintenance workers were being invited into design meetings. That was where the old hierarchy began to change. Not disappear. Change. A wealthy owner could still dismiss a technician. A technician could still be underpaid. The old abuses had not evaporated simply because the district had acquired new ideas. But the technician now possessed something more valuable than a grievance. He possessed alternatives. If one estate treated him badly, another wanted his skills. If another tried to control him, the SECZ could offer him a cooperative project. If the cooperative could not pay enough, a private client might. If the private client demanded exclusivity, he could refuse. The ability to leave changed the negotiation. That was how the integration threshold became real. Not because everybody became equal, because more people acquired the capacity to say no. Tomas began seeing this everywhere. He had originally assumed the district's transformation would be visible in buildings. Instead, it appeared in conversations. People who had once spoken deferentially to wealthy owners were beginning to disagree with them. People who had once been dismissed as uneducated were being asked for technical advice. People with money were learning to listen. People without money were learning that expertise could become a form of capital. The process was not gentle. Some people exploited it. A few technicians began charging absurd rates. Some wealthy residents attempted to create private monopolies over particular skills. Several cooperatives failed because their members could not agree about ownership. One private estate tried to recruit an entire maintenance team away from the SECZ and discovered that the team had written its own contracts protecting the cooperative's intellectual property. There were arguments over who had invented particular methods. There were accusations of appropriation. There were fights over whether ground truth knowledge could be commercialized. There were people who believed every technical improvement should belong to everyone and others who argued that without ownership there would be no incentive to develop anything difficult. Nobody solved the argument. They learned to live inside it. That, Tomas increasingly suspected, was what a functioning civilization actually looked like. Not agreement. A sufficiently stable method for disagreeing without destroying the system that made disagreement possible. The first serious conflict came when an upper-tier consortium proposed building a large private energy facility. The proposal was legal. It was financially sound. It would reduce the consortium's dependence on external electricity. It would also consume a significant amount of land and water and potentially alter the district's energy balance. The consortium presented the project as an efficiency measure. Ground truthers called it enclosure. The SECZ called it an opportunity. Residents of the former occupation were divided. The private owners were bewildered by the opposition. They had expected negotiation over price. Instead, they encountered questions about externalities, resilience, water use, maintenance capacity, and what would happen if the facility became more important to the district than its owners intended. The meeting lasted 6 hours. Tomas was there because the proposed architecture depended upon a control system he understood. He listened while people argued about ownership. Then he asked a question. What happens if the facility works perfectly? Everyone stopped. The consortium's representative answered first. We reduce our costs. Yes. And increase resilience. Yes. Tomas nodded. Then what happens when everyone else starts depending on it? The representative looked at him. We're not proposing to supply everyone. That's not what I asked. Silence settled over the room. The problem had become visible. A successful private system could create public dependency without ever intending to become public infrastructure. The more successful it became, the harder it would be to treat it as purely private. Problem the old city had solved badly. It had allowed infrastructure to become indispensable and then discovered that ownership and necessity were no longer compatible. The district did not want to repeat that mistake. But neither did it want to prohibit private investment. The compromise took weeks. The facility could be built. Its core remained privately owned. But certain emergency functions had to remain available to the district under predefined conditions. The system had to be designed so that no single failure could create a district-wide crisis. The operators had to train local personnel. Certain technical interfaces had to remain interoperable with SECZ infrastructure. The consortium accepted, not happily, but rationally. The facility was built. It became one of the most efficient energy systems in the district. And, because the integration requirements had been imposed before construction rather than after the facility became indispensable, the district avoided becoming its hostage. That was a small victory. Nobody celebrated it. There were too many other problems. The upper tier continued becoming more sophisticated. The walls did not come down. They became smarter. Security systems began recognizing not merely faces but patterns of movement. Private water systems began exchanging anonymized environmental data with district networks. Gardens became laboratories. Guest houses became research residencies. Wealthy owners began commissioning experimental structures that could function independently for months at a time. Some of them became serious patrons of ground truth. Others remained completely transactional. A few began talking about purchasing entire sections of the district. Those proposals were rejected. Not because private ownership was forbidden. Because the district had learned the difference between owning property and owning the conditions that made property valuable. The jungle could not be bought. The water table could not be purchased. The accumulated technical knowledge of the district could not be enclosed behind a wall. The social network that allowed a broken system to be repaired at midnight by someone who knew someone else was not a commodity in the conventional sense. It was a commons. And commons were valuable precisely because nobody could completely own them. The upper tier began investing in that commons. Some did it because they believed in the transition. Some because it lowered their operating costs. Some because they understood that their own security depended upon the stability of the surrounding population. Some because they saw the future and wanted a position inside it. Motives did not have to be pure for the result to become useful. That was another lesson the district was learning. One evening, Tomas was invited to a private dinner. He almost declined. He eventually went because the invitation came from someone he respected. The house belonged to one of the district's wealthiest residents, a man whose name appeared on several companies and whose properties extended far beyond Aldea Zama. Tomas had expected a formal dinner. Instead, there were 8 people around a long table and the discussion was about water. Not politics. Not investment. Water. They were arguing about whether the district's decentralized systems could eventually support a much larger population without reproducing the centralized failures of conventional cities. One guest believed the answer was more technology. Another believed it was lower consumption. A third argued that both missed the point. The system doesn't need to provide everything, she said. It needs to make people capable of providing more for themselves. Tomas looked at her. She was the same woman who had once dismissed ground truth as a collection of foreigners playing at primitive life. Now she was proposing its central principle to a room full of people who could afford almost anything. She noticed his expression. What? Nothing. You disagree? No. Then why are you smiling? Tomas looked toward the garden. I was just thinking that this place has become very strange. The woman laughed. That's what everyone said when they arrived. No, Tomas said. I mean, it has become strange in a good way. Outside, the irrigation system changed cycles. The house dimmed its lights automatically. Somewhere beneath the garden, water moved through a treatment loop. Beyond the walls, the occupation was experimenting with the same principles using fewer resources. Farther still, ground truth was doing the same thing with even fewer. And below all of them, unseen and indifferent to the distinctions between rich and poor, Pipe Dream continued extending its subaquatic presence through the cenote system. The different Aldea Zamas had not merged. They had become entangled. That was more difficult to reverse. The wealthy still had walls. The ground truthers still had their wilderness. The former occupation still carried the scars of its beginnings. The SECZ still had its committees, workshops, and arguments. The former redeemers still had their installations, their memories, and their unresolved disagreements about what should be recovered. But each now depended, in some measure, upon something that belonged to another. It was not equality. It was not harmony. It was integration. And for the first time, the people building the future of Aldea Zama were beginning to understand that the most important threshold was not the one between rich and poor, city and wilderness, or above ground and below. It was the threshold between being able to survive inside a system and being able to change it without breaking it. Tomas had crossed that threshold long before anyone had thought to name it. He was beginning to suspect that an entire civilization was approaching it with him. Chapter 97. The people who were already building. By the time the first rains arrived with enough force to expose every weakness in every roof, ditch, terrace, and drainage channel in the district, the people of Aldea Zama had become accustomed to thinking of infrastructure as something that could be argued about before it failed. This was one of the less visible achievements of the transition. 2 years earlier, most residents had understood infrastructure primarily as a service. Electricity came from somewhere, water came from somewhere, sewage went somewhere, roads were maintained by someone, and when something stopped working, the appropriate response was to determine which institution had failed to perform its obligation. The new district had not abolished that mentality so much as surrounded it with alternatives. A municipal line could still be useful while a household maintained its own storage. A public road could still matter while a neighborhood maintained its own access path. A conventional electrical connection could remain in place while a cooperative quietly reduced the amount of power it needed from it. Nothing had to be rejected merely because something else had become possible. That was what made the changes difficult to describe. There had been no revolution in the streets. No morning when everyone woke up and decided that the old city had failed and a new one would take its place. The old arrangements remained visible almost everywhere. There were still contractors, property managers, municipal crews, private security companies, utility accounts, and people whose entire working lives depended upon keeping conventional systems operating. The difference was that they were no longer alone. Around them had grown a second layer of knowledge, made up of people who had learned to solve problems before calling anyone else. Some had learned because they were ideologically committed to ground truth. Others had learned because they had been poor and could not afford to wait. Others had learned because they were curious, because they enjoyed making things, because someone had taught them, or because they had once tried to repair something and discovered that the first failure was more educational than the repair itself. Their reasons were different, but the result was increasingly similar. More people in the district knew how the place actually worked. The rain made that visible. It arrived in the afternoon with the particular violence of tropical weather that seems, for several minutes, to be less a meteorological event than a physical attack upon every exposed surface. Water hammered the roofs, overwhelmed the gutters, and turned the compacted earth along the lower roads into a brown slurry. The private estates closed their shutters and switched their systems into storm protocols. The occupation residents moved motorcycles beneath whatever cover they could find. The ground truthers watched their drainage channels, because they had spent enough time in the landscape to know that the first half hour of a storm told them more about the coming night than any forecast did. Tomas was in the fabrication cooperative when the first alarm came through. Not an emergency alarm. The district had deliberately avoided creating a hierarchy in which every unusual event became an emergency. It was simply a message on the workshop network indicating that the drainage system serving 3 blocks near the old occupation had exceeded its expected flow rate. He read the message twice. Then he stood. Elena looked up from the bench. "Where are you going?" "To see why it's high. It's raining." "I noticed." She wiped her hands on a cloth. "I'll come." They took the utility cart because walking would have been slower, although by the time they reached the affected area, the distinction between road and drainage channel had already begun to disappear. Water crossed the surface in several directions, carrying leaves, plastic fragments, and the fine sediment that accumulated wherever people had recently disturbed the soil. The old drainage infrastructure was doing exactly what it had always done under heavy rain, carrying water away from the properties that had been able to direct it toward the street and depositing the consequences somewhere else. Except that now somebody had altered the pattern. A woman named Lydia was standing ankle-deep in water beside a wall, holding a shovel. She saw Tomas and waved. "It's backing up here." "Where?" She pointed. Tomas followed the flow rather than looking for the nearest drain. He had learned that from the ground truthers. Water did not care what a plan called a channel. It followed gravity, resistance, and whatever had most recently been done to the ground. They traced it back 50 meters and found the problem. A new retaining wall had been constructed behind one of the houses. It had been built correctly according to the owner's plan, but the plan had ignored the small drainage corridor that had previously carried runoff toward a planted depression. The wall had not stopped the water. It had simply redirected it. Tomas looked at the wall. "Who built this?" A man emerged from the doorway. "I did." "Did anyone tell you about the drainage?" "I had a survey." "Your survey was for the property." The man looked toward the water. So the water doesn't care about your property." The man seemed offended. Then he looked again. That was the moment when the lesson became practical. Tomas did not tell him to demolish the wall. He asked Lydia to bring the old drainage map, then asked 2 teenagers who had been watching from beneath an awning to find where the original channel had disappeared. They found it almost immediately. One of them had helped maintain the neighborhood gardens and knew exactly where the old water path had been before several properties were rebuilt. Within an hour, the group had opened a temporary channel through the compacted soil. The water changed direction. The pressure against the wall decreased. The flooded section began draining. Nobody had called the municipality. Nobody had refused municipal help either. That distinction had become almost instinctive. The next morning, the owner of the retaining wall came to the workshop. He expected an argument. Instead, he found Lydia sitting beside the same young people who had helped redirect the water, looking at a map spread across the workbench. "I want to fix it properly," he said. Lydia looked up. "Good. I'll pay. You can." He looked relieved. Then she continued, "But you're going to learn where the water goes." He stared at her. "Why?" "Because next time you're the one who will know whether the plan makes sense." The man looked at Tomas. "Is this how things work here?" Tomas considered the question. "Increasingly." The man pulled out a chair. They spent the morning drawing the drainage system. By lunchtime, the man had learned that the property he owned was connected to a landscape that had existed long before he had purchased the land and would continue functioning after he sold it. The wall was his. The water was not. That was the kind of lesson the district had begun teaching without realizing it was teaching anything. The ground truthers had understood it from the beginning. They had simply lacked the language to explain it to people who had spent their lives inside property boundaries. Sabina had always been skeptical of the phrase, community knowledge. She considered it too flattering. Knowledge was knowledge, she said, and communities often knew very little. What mattered was whether people paid attention long enough to discover what they did not know. She had watched the district make that mistake repeatedly. A group would discover one successful technique and immediately begin treating it as doctrine. A water system would work for 6 months and become a model. A food forest would produce unusually well and become an example. A house would survive a storm and suddenly everyone wanted the same architecture. Sabina resisted that impulse. "You cannot copy an outcome," she told a group of new residents one afternoon. "You can only copy the conditions that produced it, and those conditions are never exactly the same twice." They were gathered beside a food forest that had been established during the district's first year. The plants were now mature enough to create their own shade. The soil had changed. Insects had arrived. Fungi had altered the decomposition cycle. Birds had begun carrying seeds from outside the original planting zone. What had started as a design garden was becoming something that its designers could no longer fully describe. One of the residents asked whether that meant planning was useless. Sabina laughed. "No, it means planning is temporary." She walked between the trees. "You decide what you want to encourage. Then you watch what happens. If the system behaves differently than you expected, you don't punish it for failing to obey the plan. You ask why." The resident looked toward the upper tier, visible through a gap in the vegetation. "And does that work for buildings?" "It works for everything. Even people?" Sabina stopped. "Especially people." She looked back toward the workshop where technicians were repairing the drainage equipment. "The mistake is thinking that integration means making everybody behave the same way. It doesn't. It means making different things capable of existing together without destroying one another." The resident nodded. Sabina continued walking. She had spent years watching outsiders misunderstand ground truth because they assumed its residents were trying to escape complexity. They were not. They were trying to distribute it. The old city had hidden complexity inside institutions. Ground truth placed more of it in people's hands. The transition district was discovering what happened when the two approaches met. That meeting produced an unexpected result. The young people who had helped repair the drainage channel began asking for more work. Not employment. Training. They wanted to know how the maps were made, how water flow could be modeled, how soil compaction affected drainage, how retaining structures could be designed without creating downstream failures. The SECZ workshop had already been offering technical courses, But attendance had remained uneven because many residents assumed the programs were designed for people who already possessed technical backgrounds. Tomas changed the structure. He removed the prerequisites. The first session filled immediately. The second required a waiting list. By the third, the workshop had people from every part of the district. A wealthy property manager sat beside a woman from the occupation who had never completed secondary school. A former Redeemer engineer sat beside a 17-year-old who had learned electronics from discarded appliances. A ground truth farmer sat beside an architect who had spent 20 years designing luxury residences. The first hour was awkward. The second was worse. The engineer kept correcting the teenager. The teenager kept finding practical shortcuts the engineer considered unsafe. The architect used terminology nobody else understood. The farmer ignored the terminology entirely and asked what would happen when the system encountered actual mud. By the end of the day, they had begun teaching one another. That was the moment Tomas understood that the workshop was no longer a fabrication facility. It was becoming a school. Not a school in the conventional sense. Nobody had enrolled. Nobody had applied. There were no degrees. People came because something they needed to understand was being taught by somebody who understood it. The curriculum changed constantly because the problems changed constantly. That made it difficult to fund through conventional educational structures. It also made it useful. The upper tier began sending people. That was inevitable. At first, they sent junior staff. Then they began sending senior technicians. Eventually, some owners came themselves. The first wealthy resident to attend a workshop session arrived wearing clothing that had clearly never been designed for machinery. He spent the first hour trying not to touch anything. Tomas noticed. "You're allowed to get dirty." "I know." "You don't look like you know." The man laughed. "I've been told this is good for me." "Who told you?" "My daughter." "Then you should listen." He did. By the end of the day, he had taken apart a pump, cleaned the intake assembly, and reassembled it under supervision. He had not become a technician. Nobody pretended he had. But he had learned enough to understand what his maintenance staff were talking about when they told him a pump was cavitating. That changed the relationship. The technician no longer appeared to him as somebody performing mysterious labor. The technician became somebody whose judgment he could evaluate. The owner became somebody who could ask better questions. That was the integration threshold in its most modest form. Not equality. Not revolution. Competence moving in both directions. The former occupation experienced a different transformation. Its residents had spent years being described by people outside the settlement as though the entire community belonged to a single category: poor, migrant, informal, illegal, displaced, needy. The labels changed depending upon who was speaking, but they all had the same effect. They turned individuals into a problem to be managed. The transition began to break that habit. A person who had arrived from another state 10 years earlier and learned to keep an improvised electrical network functioning during repeated failures was no longer simply an informal resident. She was an energy technician. A man who had built furniture from discarded construction materials was no longer simply someone living without adequate housing. He was a fabricator. A woman who had developed a system for preserving food through the hottest months without reliable refrigeration was not merely a poor household manager. She possessed practical knowledge that several wealthy estates were beginning to pay consultants to acquire. The vocabulary changed first, then the contracts, then the relationships. The people themselves had not suddenly become more capable. Other people had finally begun measuring the capabilities they already possessed. That was one of the most consequential changes ground truth had introduced into the district. It had not invented competence. It had created circumstances in which competence became visible. The process had its darker side. There were people who began exploiting the new market. A technician discovered that 3 estates depended upon the same specialized skill and began charging each one for exclusivity. A maker copied another person's design and attempted to claim ownership. A private investor tried to purchase the rights to an entire community-developed water system. A former corporate manager attempted to introduce a conventional hierarchy into a cooperative workshop and nearly destroyed it before the members forced him out. The district did not avoid capitalism. It had never claimed it could. Instead, it began experimenting with ways to prevent every successful relationship from becoming an ownership relationship. Some experiments failed. Some produced better contracts. Some produced arguments that lasted months. One cooperative dissolved because its members could not agree about intellectual property. Another survived precisely because it had written a brutally clear agreement after watching the first one fail. That was how the district learned. Not by eliminating mistakes, by making mistakes survivable enough to become information. The former redeemers understood this instinctively. Their old corporation had possessed enormous resources for correcting errors, but it had often lacked the institutional courage to admit that an error had occurred until the consequences had become impossible to hide. The transition district was developing a different culture. Failure could still be expensive, could still hurt, could still destroy a project. But the person who said, "This isn't working," was increasingly less likely to be treated as the enemy. That was a small cultural change with enormous technical consequences. One evening, Arturo visited the workshop. He had been spending more time there recently, although he still preferred the recovered Redeemer installation where the work was quieter and the equipment more familiar. He watched the people moving through the building for several minutes before approaching Tomas. "You've changed it." Tomas looked up. "What?" "The workshop. I've repaired some things. Not the machines." Arturo looked around. "Those people." Tomas followed his gaze. A ground truth farmer was explaining soil moisture to a programmer. Two teenagers were trying to diagnose a failed motor. A former Redeemer engineer was patiently answering questions from a woman who had never worked with industrial equipment before. In the corner, the investor from the earlier council meeting was sitting beside a technician from the occupation, discussing the financing of a fabrication project neither could have undertaken alone. "I didn't do that," Tomas said. "No." Arturo smiled. "That's the point." They stood watching for a while. Then Arturo said, "Do you know what the old company was always trying to build?" Tomas shook his head. "Integration. Systems integration? Everything integration. People, technology, logistics, capital, information. We thought if we could connect enough things, the system would become intelligent. And it did." Arturo looked toward the room. "Then we discovered that intelligence doesn't automatically make a system wise." Tomas considered that. "What makes it wise?" Arturo smiled. "I don't know." He looked again at the workshop. "Maybe enough people who are allowed to disagree with it." The rain returned that night. This time the drainage channels held. The retaining wall stayed dry. The water moved through the planted corridor and into the basin the neighborhood had restored. Sensors recorded the flow, but nobody needed the sensors to know whether the system was working. The people who had built it could see the water behaving correctly. At the upper-tier estate, the new maintenance architecture switched 3 systems into storm mode without calling anyone. At the occupation, a teenager who had attended Tomas's workshop spent half the night repairing a damaged solar controller. At Ground Truth, Sabina walked the food forest with a lantern, checking the trees. At the recovered Redeemer facility, a diagnostic system continued its quiet testing cycle. And beneath all of them, the cenote water moved through limestone in darkness. No one above ground had yet understood how much of the future was already traveling through that water. For the moment, the district was still learning the simpler lesson. The people who had been assumed to need civilization were discovering that they could help build it. The people who had believed they already possessed civilization were discovering that they needed those people. And the people who had spent their lives building systems were discovering that the most resilient system they had ever encountered was not a machine at all. It was a population learning, unevenly and sometimes painfully, how to make itself useful to itself. The change did not make Aldea Zama equal. It made the old hierarchy less certain. That was enough to make almost everyone pay attention. Chapter 98, The Terms of Looking. The first outside response arrived sooner than the council had expected, although not from the institution they had been expecting to hear from. That distinction mattered. The report concerning the passage beneath Site B had been circulated only to the people who needed to read it, and even then the circulation had been deliberately narrow. No photographs had been posted to the district network. No coordinates had been included in any public notice. The council had not announced a discovery, because it had not yet decided what had been discovered, and Sabina had been particularly insistent that the difference between those two statements remain intact for as long as possible. A photograph of a worked surface in a cave could become a story before anyone had established what the surface was. A story could become a claim. A claim could become an investigation. An investigation could become a jurisdictional dispute. By the time competent people arrived to determine whether the original observation had been correct, the thing itself might already have been buried beneath everyone else's interpretation of it. That was why the council's first task was not to find an archaeologist. It was to find the right kind of archaeologist. The distinction produced more disagreement than anyone anticipated. There were institutions in Mexico with excellent specialists. There were universities with cave archaeology programs. There were hydrologists who had spent decades working with the regional aquifer. There were foreign researchers who had published extensively on subterranean environments and would probably have been delighted to examine a previously undocumented system. There were also government offices whose statutory responsibilities might be triggered by a discovery of archaeological significance, whether or not the district believed those offices should be the first people through the entrance. Nobody in the pavilion disputed expertise. They disputed sequence. Once we call them, Perla said, we can't control what happens next. We don't control it now, Emilio replied. We control more of it now than we will afterward. That isn't an argument against calling them. No, it's an argument against calling the wrong ones first. Sabina sat with her hands folded, listening to them circle the problem. She had become accustomed to the way people talked when they were frightened by something they considered important. They became procedural. They reached for categories, committees, precedents, and institutional names because those things made uncertainty feel administratively containable. She understood the impulse. She also understood that a cave did not become safer because the paperwork surrounding it became more sophisticated. We need 3 people, she said. The room quieted. One who understands the stone, she continued. One who understands the water. And one who understands what human beings have done to places like this without deciding in advance what they are looking at. Perla nodded. Archaeology. Not necessarily. Sabina looked toward the photographs on the table. If we decide what those marks are before anyone has examined the whole environment, we're already telling the person who comes next what they are supposed to find. Tomas understood. You want somebody who can look without needing the answer to be interesting. Sabina smiled. Exactly. It was the first useful description anyone had produced all evening. They added another condition. The people invited would come as consultants to the district, not as representatives of an institution claiming possession of the discovery. Their first visit would be observational. No excavation, no removal of material, no expansion of the passage, no sampling without explicit permission from the council. The photographs, measurements, and notes generated during the initial consultation would belong to the district archive, with copies provided to the specialists for their own research. That last condition provoked the strongest objection. You can't make ownership claims over scientific observations, someone said. We aren't, Perla replied. We're making an access agreement. And if they refuse, then we find someone else. The statement was simple enough that it ended the argument. For once, the district did not need to pretend that cooperation required surrender. Tomas was asked to prepare the technical material for the consultants. He disliked the assignment immediately, not because he disliked the work, because he had begun to recognize the danger of becoming too interested in the thing beneath Site B. The first survey had been a technical anomaly. The second had become a historical question. The report now contained language that could easily transform it into something much larger. Deliberate construction. Unknown age. Unknown origin. Larger system. Those 4 phrases looked harmless on the page. Together they were combustible. He sat alone in the workshop after closing and reconstructed the survey from the original data. He did not look at the photographs at first. He wanted the geometry without the suggestion. The passage descended from the original void at a shallow angle before leveling out. The airflow remained directional. That continued to bother him. Natural cave systems could produce airflow, certainly, but the consistency of the movement was unusual given the limited information they had about the surrounding cavities. The passage also widened in a way that did not fit the initial expectation of a narrow karst conduit. The first team had described the widening cautiously, but Tomas could see it more clearly when he plotted the measurements. The passage was not simply getting larger. It was becoming more usable. He stared at the graph. That was an interpretation, not a measurement. He deleted the annotation, then put it back. He sat there for another 10 minutes. Finally, he wrote, "Passage geometry changes from constricted access to sustained human-scale volume." That was better. It said what he had observed without telling the reader what to think. He saved the file. Then he opened the photographs. The worked surface appeared almost embarrassingly ordinary on the screen. That was what disturbed him. It wasn't spectacular. There was no monumental doorway, no enormous chamber, no elaborate carving, no obvious technological object. Just a portion of stone whose smoothness did not make geological sense and a series of marks that did not immediately belong to any known category. The human mind wanted spectacle. The actual discovery offered ambiguity. Tomas preferred ambiguity. It was less likely to kill you. The first consultant arrived 3 days later. Her name was Dr. Ana Lucia Herrera, and she was irritated before she reached the pavilion. Not with the district, with the road. She had been told that the final approach would be difficult and had assumed this meant inconvenient. It meant something closer to philosophical. The vehicle had reached a point where the road ceased being a meaningful engineering object and became a series of negotiated possibilities between mud, roots, and whatever surface had survived the last rain. When she finally arrived, she stepped out of the vehicle, looked toward the pavilion and said, "You people built a transition district and forgot to transition the road." Perla laughed. Ana Lucia looked at her. Good. Someone here has a sense of humor. They liked her immediately. She spent the first hour asking almost no questions about the cave. Instead, she asked about the foundation. Who had commissioned the original survey? Which instruments had been used? What was the calibration history? What had been known about the geology before the anomaly appeared? Had construction disturbed the ground before the radar scan? Had there been changes in water level? Had anyone entered the void before the survey team? Had the district experienced unusual subsidence elsewhere? What other subterranean structures existed within a 5-kilometer radius? The questions were not glamorous. They were excellent. Tomas watched her work and realized that she was doing exactly what Sabina had wanted. She was refusing the story. When she finally examined the photographs, she did not say ancient. She did not say Maya. She did not say archaeological. She said, "Interesting." Sabina smiled. "That's all. For now." "You've seen the marks. I've seen photographs of marks. You don't think they're natural. I don't know. They look worked. They look like something happened to the stone." Sabina waited. Ana Lucia looked at her. "You want me to say more? I want you to say what you actually think. I think whoever made these marks, if somebody made them, had access to a surface that was already convenient to work. I think the passage itself matters more than the marks. And I think everyone is going to spend the next 6 months staring at the marks because they're easier to photograph." Sabina's smile widened. "Yes." Ana Lucia looked around. "Why are you smiling?" "Because you noticed." The hydrologist arrived the following day. He was less charming. This did not concern anyone. His name was Rafael Ordóñez, and he had spent 30 years working in subterranean water systems. He looked at the district's preliminary map, then at the passage measurements, then at the airflow records. He asked for the original radar data. Tomas gave it to him. Raphael studied the file for several minutes. Your sensor wasn't wrong. Tomas waited. It also wasn't telling you what you thought it was telling you. I didn't think it was telling me anything specific. Good. Raphael looked up. Most people do. He asked to see the site. The council approved the visit under the same restrictions as before. When they reached the passage, Raphael did not immediately enter. He stood at the entrance and listened. The airflow was barely audible. Tomas had become so accustomed to it that he almost missed the sound. Raphael closed his eyes. What do you hear? Air. That's what I hear too. He opened his eyes. The question is where it comes from. They entered. The passage seemed smaller than Tomas remembered. That happened underground. The human body changed scale when there was no horizon. A chamber that looked enormous on a survey became intimate when you stood inside it. A corridor that looked harmless on a map could become oppressive after 20 minutes of darkness. Raphael moved slowly. He stopped several times. He examined the walls. He touched nothing. At the worked section, he crouched and examined the surface from several angles. Then he moved on. The marks did not interest him nearly as much as the air. At the widening point, he stopped again. This isn't simply a pocket. Tomas looked at him. No. Raphael shook his head. Don't agree with me yet. Tomas smiled. Fair. Raphael pointed toward the passage ahead. If the airflow is coming from a connected system, we need to know whether that system is hydrologically connected to the aquifer in a way that changes anything on the surface. Could it? Of course it could. How? Pressure, seasonal recharge, contaminant movement, gas exchange, temperature. There are 100 possibilities. He looked back toward the entrance. But that's not the most interesting question. What is? Raphael looked at the smooth wall. Why did nobody map this before? That question stayed with Tomas. The regional mapping projects had been extensive. The coast had been studied for decades. The aquifer had been mapped, modeled, and revised repeatedly. Yet the passage had remained invisible until a medical facility foundation happened to be placed almost directly above it. That did not mean the system had been deliberately hidden. It meant only that the known world was smaller than people like to imagine. Still, the coincidence was unsettling. That night Tomas went through historical survey material. He found references to sinkholes, old diving reports, property surveys, water tables, aerial imagery, cave entrances that had been documented and later lost. A hand-drawn map from the 1970s showing several features that had never appeared on more recent municipal plans. Then he found something else. A notation. Not about Site B. Not about the passage. 3 kilometers away. The notation described an area of unusually persistent airflow from a small sinkhole. The date was 1978. Tomas stared at it. The report had been classified as inconclusive. He read the paragraph again. Then he printed it. Sabina was awake when he brought it to her. She had a habit of leaving her courtyard door open at night, regardless of the weather. She claimed that closed doors made people forget where they were. Tomas handed her the page. She read it, then read it again. 3 kilometers. Yes. From Site B. Approximately. Approximately. 3.2. Depending on which map you use. Sabina looked at him. You think it's connected? I think I don't know. She nodded. Good. Tomas sat down. I thought you'd say that. You came here because you wanted me to tell you what it means. No. You came because you wanted someone to stop you from deciding. He smiled. Maybe. Sabina folded the paper. Did the report mention the diver? Tomas looked at her. The one your great-grandfather talked about? Yes. No. She seemed almost relieved. Good. Why? Because if it did, we'd have a story. She handed the paper back. And right now we need evidence. The next morning, the council convened without announcing a formal meeting. This had become another district habit. Not every important discussion needed to become an event. People arrived carrying coffee, wet boots, notebooks, photographs, and contradictory opinions. The specialists sat near the front. The exploration team sat together. Vesper was not there. She had already returned to active deployment, as she had said she would. Tomas noticed her absence only because, over the past few days, he had begun to associate the pavilion's discussions with the strange possibility that she might one day choose to remain. He put the thought aside. The council began. Ana Lucia summarized the geological findings. Raphael explained the hydrological uncertainty. Perla reviewed the exploration protocol. Then Sabina stood. She did not bring her great-grandfather's photograph this time. She brought the old 1978 report. "This isn't evidence of a connection," she said. "It isn't evidence of anything except that someone noticed airflow in another place 48 years ago." She placed the document on the table. "But I think we should take seriously the possibility that what we've found isn't a single cave." The room shifted. She continued before anyone could turn that possibility into a conclusion. "I also think we should not explore every related site simply because we now know where to look. If there is a larger system, it has existed without us for a very long time. We have no reason to behave as though discovering it gives us the right to immediately occupy it." A man near the back raised his hand. "What if somebody else discovers it?" Sabina looked at him. "Then we will have to deal with that. But shouldn't we secure it?" "Secure it from whom?" "From looters." "Yes." "Researchers." "No." "Government." She paused. "That depends on what they want to do." There was some laughter. "Not enough to make the issue disappear." Perla took over. "The council's recommendation is to establish a temporary protected survey zone around the known access point. No excavation, no commercial diving, no private exploration, no disclosure of coordinates beyond the approved team. We continue surface hydrological monitoring and consult with additional specialists." "How long?" "Until we know enough to make the next decision intelligently." "How long is that?" Perla looked around the pavilion. "That is not a question we can answer yet." Nobody liked the answer. They accepted it anyway. After the meeting, Tomas stayed behind. Ana Lucia approached him. "You've been looking at the old maps." He nodded. "Don't." He frowned. "Why?" "Because you're going to find more anomalies." "I already did." "I know." She smiled. "That's why I'm telling you." Tomas looked toward the Site B records. "Wouldn't that be useful?" "Eventually." "Then why not now?" "Because you're an engineer." He waited. "You see a system," she said. "That is one of your strengths. It is also one of your vulnerabilities." She pointed toward the passage report. "You found one thing that behaves like part of something larger. Your brain is already looking for the larger thing." Tomas did not deny it. "You're saying I should stop." "I'm saying you should let somebody else look first." "Who?" "Someone whose first question isn't where the next piece is." She smiled. "That's why historians exist." Tomas laughed. "You're an archaeologist." "Exactly." She walked away. He remained where he was, thinking about that distinction. The district had spent 2 years learning how to build things without assuming that everything had to be built immediately. Now it was learning whether it could discover something without immediately trying to possess it. That might prove harder. Far from the pavilion, beyond the district's immediate jurisdiction, the existence of the passage had already begun to travel. Not through an official announcement, through a photograph. A subcontractor who had worked on the original Site B survey had retained a copy of one image on a personal device. He had shown it to a colleague in a regional engineering office. The colleague had sent it to someone who knew someone who had worked on cave systems elsewhere in Quintana Roo. The image acquired a new caption. Then another. Then another. By the end of the week, the original context had been reduced to a sentence. Unmapped artificial passage discovered beneath Tulum development. Nobody in the pavilion knew that yet. They would. Soon. And somewhere else, somebody who knew exactly how sensitive subterranean infrastructure could become was already looking at the same photograph and asking a different question from the one the district had been asking. Not, who built it? Not, how old is it? Not even, where does it lead? But, who else knows? The answer at that moment was still almost nobody. That was about to change. Discussion text. Recent episodes. Persistent Service Asset Part 13. 11 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Persistent Service Asset Part 12. 23 hours ago. Persistent Service Asset Part 11. August 11th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or to truly comprehend the Zeta Male, ye must look past the petty posturing of the shorebound world and examine the uncompromising ethos of the High Seas Pirate Charter. Not the theme park version with the parrot and the eye patch, but the one sitting in the historical record. Between
MXTM Studios presents the MXTM Verse. Tomorrow's canon. This isn't a soundtrack to a single story. It's the soundtrack to an entire civilization.
Every generation, different seas, same charge. Move the silver without a license. Feed the colony they let starve. Build the future they refuse to fund. We've been doing this since 6130. We're still doing it. This is the log.
From the Buccaneers burning through the Caribbean, brush to the Sea Rovers working where the empires couldn't rush. We came through the gaps, the shallow water decays. No Pablo Monopoly, no letters patent, no crown. We rewrote the articles while the governor came down. Equal shares on deck, a vote before the sale. Train the neural networks on the stairs by Riot, stolen sea. The trillion-dollar models that run the industry. Kept in A's, fed on pirate archives while the lawyers turn their eyes. So don't talk to me about theft, this is how it always worked. The Buccaneers fed the colony before the model learned. The shadow engine ran and then the credit got transferred. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control.
Take a long look, matey. The city on the horizon be ripe for the taking, and the tide be turning in our favor as the sun dips below the waves.
The algorithms say we don't exist. The graphs come back empty. The metrics insist. No audience, no market, no trend. Yet somehow we keep arriving again, walking through the ruins of somebody else's plan, watching perfect narratives slip through their own hands.
The people who are already here. A note for the untabulated: the algorithms say you don't exist. Description to someone else's conclusions.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
I just finished writing a book I didn't plan to write. It started as a countercultural addendum to the Aldea Post-Corporate Transition District Handbook, a rougher, more urgent document aimed at the generation the credential economy forgot to accommodate. It became something else.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap.
First move. Counterintuitively, you don't start by leasing land or building physical spaces. Nope, you start by publishing a manifesto. Think of it as an intellectual constitution. You're capturing the conceptual territory before a single brick is even laid, creating a framework that the community's physical life is going to eventually animate. Ultimately, creating the next era of human communities isn't about laying bricks first. It's about boldly defining the rules of the game so others can build upon them.
Earth.